Hello friends, we are running this series on short fiction and particularly written in the 19th century or around it. And already we have covered many stories over the last 3-4 months, and today we will be covering Dr. Richa Bajaj is there with us as a speaker, and she teaches English in Hindu College, Delhi University. So she will be talking about Walter Scott as a short story writer. Actually, this is surprising that he is referred to, Walter Scott is referred to as a short story writer, because he is basically a novelist and a historical novelist, and he started a genre called historical novel, and there are books on this particular aspect of fiction in English literature. And the short story in his hands would be closer to the writing of the novel. It would be closer to the characters that he picked up perhaps in the novels. It would be episodic, and we'll know more about it. And I just request Dr. Bajaj to tell us something general about this writer, his age, and what made him write about history, if that is required for the discussion, and then the story itself would be analyzed and presented. So Dr. Bajaj, please.
Thank you, Professor Prakash. Yes, I would like to today introduce Walter Scott as a short story writer. He's primarily known as a novelist and poet also, but the short stories really give us a glimpse of his romantic fiction, and these stories are filled with folklore and dramatic episodes that are set in the Scottish Highlands. So I think that is how I would like to introduce him. Of course, his time period is 1771 to 1832. And what is more important to note here is that I have delivered a lecture on Walter Scott as a novelist when I discussed Ivanhoe, but you see, and therefore I felt the need to talk about him today as a short story writer, because it's again a writer who's using the same kind of thematic concerns, but then using a different form. That way we also get to know about the difference in the form, that is how a novel gets written in the hands of the same writer, and how is a short story portrayed, and what is there in the short story that is not there in the novel. So he's a writer of historical fiction, but he adds more romance to his short stories. And as a short story writer, Scott actually picks up for analysis different points of views, and captured in a moment of crisis. In fact, he's aware that the short story cannot carry the history and the tradition of a place or a people like the novel can, and yet I think he's also conscious of the fact that it must capture that moment of crisis and present as many points of view as possible around that moment of crisis. So I think that's a very interesting dimension which is there in his short story. Look at one of the very interesting quotes that the narrator, in fact it's the author narrator, who gives a sense of an idea about the short story to us, where the narrator in this story, The Death of the Laird's Jock, compares the artist who paints with the short story writer. Okay, now this artist who paints knows that a single now is all which he can present. I quote, "A single now is all which he can present," unquote. With a creative writer also it's similar, because he says that the narrative that he's going to write in this short story, which is again the death of the Laird's Jock, is as much like a painting, which means if it is like a painting, then it is going to capture that single now, which is all that he can present. Now, in capturing it, again, I quote from the story itself, the narrator says, where the interest, I quote, "where the interest is so much concentrated in one strong moment of agonized passion, that it can be understood and sympathized with at a single glance," unquote. This is the essence of the short story and its potential as a literary genre. The fact that he compares, I mean, you were saying that, well, it's like the novel. I feel that what here Walter Scott is trying to say, it's probably more like a painting, like an artist in the hands of an artist who knows that this is all that he has, this one single glance is all that he has when he's painting a piece. And so as a short story writer also, this creative writer has only as much space, and very similar to that single glance of an artist. So he says that the interest is concentrated in one strong moment of agonizing passion in a short story. And so I mean, how would you react to it? Concentrated, everything is so much is concentrated in one strong moment of agonizing passion.
No, actually, the question is well raised, because the writer generally has a point of view and he has many things to share with the audience. But then when it comes to short story, then he just wants to pick up an impression and convey that impression to us. And around that impression are built, and this is, I mean, you might consider it as a point of expansion, around the the one single brush stroke. There are many things that are associated, and maybe he is pointing towards them, hinting about them, and you feel that, well, you are focusing upon one thing, but around there is other area, peripheral area, and that area also is contributing to it. Is that the case here?
No, in fact, the opposite is what probably I'm trying to suggest here, that he's saying that there are many dimensions, but that's not what he wants to focus in a short story, at least in some kinds of short stories. And other short stories are more narrative oriented, and there what you're saying is true. But in a lot of short stories, he's conscious of the fact that he wants to concentrate all his energies on that one single moment, and which is the strongest moment in the story, around which, which actually reveal the agonized passions of human beings.
How do you talk about the agonized passion? Is it an excited thing, something that really draw our attention towards it, and you see a person in doldrums and in the form of passion? How do you interpret this?
I think this, because most of it, you see, this agonized passion is a reference to a problem, to a conflict, which is at the center of any story in him, in his works. Every story has a conflict embedded in it, right? There is this one moment of conflict or crisis, you could say, where, so some of his stories build up to that crisis, some of them straight away take us to that crisis. That's probably the only difference. But there is a moment of crisis where things appear to be normal, and then suddenly there is a moment of truth, or suddenly there is a moment where rivalries are drawn, where where the time of test is there, right? Where the characters are being tested for their value, for their worth, for the decisions and the choices that they make. So that could be a moment of choice, that could be the moment of a very important choice that the character must make, that could be the moment of a duel, that could be a moment of deciding to kill a man or not to kill, for instance. So all those are, I think, what he refers to as the agonizing passions, where there is conflict, where there is dilemma, where there is a very strong sense of contradiction which is present in the moment, which gets transferred to the character. So there is a contradiction in the moment that forces the character to think about one's choices, that in fact also makes him be ambiguous about his own decisions.
It's a very fine, description of the crisis that you're talking about, because crisis is that moment which has a history, and crisis, after the crisis, things when the crisis is resolved, then there is a new kind of thing. So maybe he is, through this particular moment, pointing towards the spirit of change that is there in the context of time and history. How do you react to that?
Yes, the spirit of change, yes, but Scott, I found that Walter, and this is something that I became probably more clear through the short stories after having read the novels, that Scott is actually, there is a sense of, so there is a conflict, and when you talked about a resolution, and I thought, what is the resolution that Scott gives? More often than not, you find that the resolution is tragic. Right? There is a tragic sense towards the end of the stories, he's not written many stories, but whatever he's written, you find that there is a tragic sense in all of them. The characters are caught in a dilemma, caught in a situation, and the resolution is mostly tragic. And then it got me to thinking that why is it tragic? Why is Scott tragic in his stories? Why is the ending leading us to a sort of a nostalgia or tragic end? Because there is romance. you see, Scott is, when you say that this is the spirit of the age or the time that he is a part of, the time of change, we have to remember that Scott is divided in his, there is on one hand the feudal Scotland, right, of the Jacobites also. There is a feudal Scotland on one hand, and then there is the Scotland of law and commerce. Now, Scott is obviously on the side, I mean, he's a part of this new world, which is the world of law and commerce. He was a lawyer himself, right? He was an advocate. So he is very much a product of this world of law and commerce, but there is a sense of nostalgia and there is a sense of, endearment that he has for that lost world. Now, he can see the problems of that feudal order. And most of his stories revolve around this, this juxtaposition between the old order and the demands of the old order, the romance attached to that old order, the feudal order, and the new sort of life that exists in Scotland. So, and when we come to, and again, Scott is someone who actually compels you to go to history. I mean, if you read his stories, you are automatically taken to a historical period, and more often than not, he's focusing on one or another period which is back in time, and which is why he's historical. So it's not about focusing on the present history, it's more about the past century, for instance, in this case, or to go further down in history to other eras, where he's trying to, in almost all his works, he's trying to understand the negotiations that take place between two communities, two cultures, and two nations. So, for instance, in Ivanhoe, he went back to 11th, 12th century, where he's talking about the negotiations between the Saxons and the Normans. But actually, he is always talking about Scotland and England. The kind of negotiations that go on. Even when he used the Saxon or Norman metaphor, he was actually talking about Scotland and England. And in these stories, he's directly talking about this kind of uneasy relationship that is shared between the people of Scotland and England. So I think he takes you back in time in history, and for you to judge, it's his stories are actually very dramatic. He builds an entire drama around scenes. So he actually forces, much like drama, much like you would be sitting in a playhouse and you would be watching as audience, he actually compels the reader to judge the situation, to judge characters, to evaluate on whose side they are. Because clearly Scott himself is ambiguous maybe to some extent, but I think it's not so much of an ambiguity. He knows that the new world with law and the new world of law and commerce is where he belongs, but he cannot help looking back with a sense of romance at his own past, and at his own history. So I think there is this division, there is this change that we are referring to, and this is also the period of conflict leading, the period of conflict that emerges from the union between Scotland and England that took place in 1707. So this is the time when Scotland comes to join England and becomes United Kingdom, with England. And so you could, and it is done primarily for economical and political reasons, because Scotland was facing a lot of economic stagnation, and they were, most of the people, of the Highlands were rural people, and the lower part of Scotland was still having trade with England, but all these Highland people would sell their cattle, they would subsist on the sale of cattle and linen to England. So it became a sort of a perhaps a sense of requirement at the time and necessity at the time to join hands with England. But then once Scotland joins hands with England, to what extent has there been this kind of cultural assimilation that has taken place? Have people really of both sides, have they accepted one another, or are they still, they resist and exist as rivals with one another? So these are some of the questions that he takes up, the differences in the cultures of the Scots and the English, and how they resist this sense of assimilation which has otherwise taken place politically and economically, but not so culturally in the social sphere. I think that is this is what is at the center of much of Scott's writing.
In the context of now, the word that he used, that he in short stories talks about the now. So I was thinking about this now, in his life also. He's born in 1771. Within 4 years of his birth, the American War of Independence happens. After another 15 years or so, the French Revolution happens. So I think he is born in the times of change, in the times of crises, and the old and the new that you so rightly point out. Would you agree?
Yes, I think so. That is the case because and England was also drawn to different wars in the 18th century. For instance, the 7-year wars that took place, and the entire Europe was involved. And during the 1750s or so, in this time also, Scotland gets involved in the war because it is now a part of England. So. And then how are the Scots reacting to this? They have to fight a war that they did not enter, and it's just been a couple of decades that they've been a part of this country, and they're already thrown into a war in the 1750s.
And they appear to be sitting on a volcano, because things can happen anyway.
Right. So so therefore I think he had this sympathy for the Jacobites of the 18th century. But by the time Scott is in writing about all these, we must remember, I also want to point out one more thing, that when Scott comes to short story writing, he comes to short story writing much later in his career. He begins with the novels and poems, and goes on to write long poems, and becomes the established poet before Byron takes over. So he was an established poet, and then of course the Waverley novels that he wrote. So he is known for this, but he moves to writing about writing the short stories much later in his career, and that is because he had some financial difficulties that he had to face. He was in a lot of debt, and when his friends offered to help him, he said, no, my right hand will pay off for it. So so he started to write, and this is in the 1820s, when he begins to write a lot of novels, and this is also the time when he's contributing his short stories to various journals. So remember 1820s, Scott dies in 1832. So this is really, and one of his last stories that are written in 1831. So he's towards, and it's not like he's only writing short stories, he's also writing novels, but his stories are mature stories. It's not a young writer dabbling in fiction and just trying out the territory. He already knows, he's already a famous, he's become Sir Walter Scott. He's won acclaim and renown because of the works. In fact, he often signs his works, even one of his short stories, as the author of Waverley. So he's already, the author of Waverley is an established name. He did not give out his name initially. So when he comes to writing the short story, we must remember that he is already tried and tested the art of fiction, and he's using this in therefore a very mature way. In one of the stories that I mentioned earlier, he's using it as a kind of a painting, where he wants to, in fact, in that story of Scott, the death of the lad's Jock, he in fact talks about this man who was the star of the community, who was the star of the clan. He had won many wars, and he was the only one who could wield the two-handed sword. It was so heavy that people could not lift it, and he could fight battles with it. So he was, the last name to reckon with in Scotland. For his clan and country, he stood as a symbol of valor. And it is this man that and he shows in this short story how this man has aged and lost the capacity, and lost his this kind of vivacity, and also lost this kind of physical health that he was known for. And he expects his son to pick the battles that he left, and he expects his son to fill in his shoes, but his son is obviously not as capable as the father. And he loses, and when his son enters a duel with an Englishman, he loses, and he's killed in that battle, in that duel, and the man takes the the sword that was the pride of Lad's Jock. He takes that sword from him as a symbol of as a symbol of Scotland itself, and he takes that sword and goes away and takes it back to England. So for Lad's Jock, it is the moment of crisis, that he has been stripped of honor. He has been stripped of his Scottish lineage in losing that sword to an Englishman. And the story actually ends with this old man Laird's Jock's scream. And the narrator tells us that if a painter can just paint this moment, then this is the essence of my story. The scream of this man, that is the agonized scream of this man. In fact, I was reminded of Edmund Munch's painting that came out much later in the 19th century, The Scream, which he became very famous for. Where there is again a man, with a skull-like face, who's screaming, right? And when I read this story, and this story was published in 1831. So it is about a dying man's scream. Again, we must remember that this is also the time when Scott has become very frail in health, and he's not able to write. I mean, this is probably one of his last works that he's writing, and he's writing about a man on his deathbed, the Laird's Jock, who's lost his earlier sort of muscular strength, and he's become lean and he's become frail, right? And so the agonized scream of Laird's Jock is actually comparable to Scott's own sort of situation at the time, where he is also become frail. And maybe who knows, Edmund Munch took for inspiration this kind of a metaphor of the scream, because very clearly this story is written as if it were a painting, and very interestingly, it is also written as a letter. The entire story is a letter to the editor of Keepsake, where this story was published. So I think that's the kind of experimentation he's doing with the form of the short story, but also trying to capture a single moment of agony that a Scot feels when he has lost to an Englishman. So this is very important in Scott's work, I think.
Tell us something about the sense of tragedy that you referred to.
This is the tragedy. So in this, you see, if you notice that there is a man who has all his life been known for upholding the values of Scottish honor, and here is this man who's on his deathbed and who gave his ancestral sword to his son to fight that battle for the country and the clan, and the son loses it. And in that moment, the man has lost his son, but more importantly, he doesn't grieve the fact that he's lost his son so much, but the fact that he's lost his sword, which is a symbol of Scottish pride. So I think that is the tragedy, and the story ends with the scream of the man who finally dies. This kind of a horrible, agonized scream that is heard throughout the country, and he obviously dramatizes that scene, dramatizes that picture of Scotland. So in a way, the tragedy of Laird's Jock is the tragedy of Scotland, that it is very soon, it would be stripped of its pride and honor, and it would be taken over and by Englishmen.
Which means, the scream is there, and through the scream the pain is given, the pain is expressed, and that is a kind of protest.
Right.
He wants to write things, write history and all those things, and that cannot happen. So tragedy is that there is a loss, but it always refers to the struggle to fight that loss and make it kind of prosperity.
The struggle to fight and the inability
to do so.
The inability to do so, that, but I wouldn't say that, again, I'll probably come to this question in the following lecture, but I wouldn't say that Walter Scott is entirely romantic in his projections of the Scots. He sees that there is also, it's a kind of love for your, your culture, but also to be able to see the problems within it, that take it too far. For instance, the idea of pride is taken too far to, to mean everything for you. That one cannot, that the idea of assimilation is not possible because the Scots are in a time warp, or the Scots refuse to, move ahead in life and join the English. So I think there is this kind of and that's why I say there is this kind of a paradox, because he understands that they need to do that. They cannot expect the new generation to be like them. Like, it is foolish on the part of, for instance, Led's Jock to believe that his son will be able to do what he did, and this kind of disappointment that he has with his son is the disappointment that the older generation has with the new generation, that has already begun to see that the Scottish fight against the English is is useless in many ways, because now they are the same country, now they are the part of the same country.
So friends, in this part of the discussion, Dr. Bajaj has talked about the paradox that the situation has become finally in the story, and that it raises questions, at the same time it points towards the reality of a changing kind. So with that particular idea, we come to the end of the first part of the discussion, and soon the second part of the discussion will follow. Thanks.